Here that did not exist in the early 1980s. I feel that you're reflecting experiences and events of a period in the past, and that much has happened, particularly in recent years, in many countries where they have been able to achieve some success in their economic performance.
I don't agree. It is now 1991. Debt is still a major problem for countries like the Philippines and perhaps 70 other third world countries who are still in the debt trap. From the point of view of the banks, the debt crisis is already over because they are covered by loan loss reserves. From the point of view of multilaterals, the debt crisis is over because there has not been any interruption in payments to them. They have set their conditionalities, they have set their terms, and they have made sure that they will be paid continuously. So from their point of view, the debt crisis is over because they are safe. The multilaterals are safe, the commercial banks are safe, the bilateral countries are safe, but the people of the third world are not safe because they continue to pay a debt.
Debt was crucial to the pressure exerted by the United States in building the so-called coalition against Saddam Hussein. The Gulf War was said to be the dawn of a new age for the United Nations, the New World Order in action. In fact, the United States was able to tailor the UN Security Council to its war plans by using debt in the international banks. Egypt was told that if it joined the coalition, $14 billion would be wiped off its national debt. And Iran, reported Reuters, was rewarded for its support of the United States with its first loan from the World Bank since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The day before the ground attack, the bank approved a loan to Iran of $250 million. And China received the first World Bank loan since the Tiananmen Square massacre, just 1 week after the Chinese foreign minister met President Bush at the White House. Outside the bank, Syria was promised a $1 billion arms deal brokered by Washington, and a photo opportunity was arranged with President Bush. An international terrorist was suddenly an old friend. The vote of the non-permanent members of the Security Council was critical. Minutes after Yemen voted against the resolution to go to war, a senior American diplomat was instructed to tell the Yemeni ambassador, "That was the most expensive no vote you ever cast," meaning that $70 million in American aid to one of the poorest countries in the world would be stopped. The use of debt in bribing the coalition was nothing new. Manipulation of the World Bank was documented in the early 1980s in a secret U.S. Treasury report. The United States, says the report, is capable and willing to pursue important policy objectives in the banks by exercising the financial and political leverage at our disposal. In other words, the U.S. is able to impose its will on the World Bank. Britain's influence on the international banks is small compared with the United States, but British high street banks are deeply involved in third world debt. In 1 year, 1990, poor countries transferred more than £6 billion net to British banks. On top of this, the banks were allowed tax relief on making provision for so-called doubtful loans. From 1987 to 1990, this tax relief amounted to £1.6 billion, the equivalent of 10 times what the British public gives in charitable donations to the third world. We invited all the high street banks to be interviewed about this. All of them refused. So we asked the Bankers Association to explain it, and they said it was nothing unusual. As in all business debt, they said, the tax relief would have to be paid back when the principal loan was paid back. In the meantime, the banks can keep the tax relief and still demand interest payments. And this constant demand is true also of the IMF and the World Bank.
Clearly, one is not repaying money that one has not borrowed in the first place. So whatever is now being repaid was in fact disbursed the other way some years earlier. And what you're observing, in fact, is first of all the interest that is payable on borrowings, which I think any person with a mortgage would readily recognize. You're observing a lot of rescheduling of these payments. All of the severely indebted countries that you are concerned about have in fact rescheduled, i.e. postponed their payments very significantly to many of their creditors. And what you're observing also is the payment of interest on the monies that are in their use.
In 1991, Prime Minister John Major announced that the British government would wipe out the debts of certain African countries. The gesture was important, but accounts for only 1% of worldwide debt. To end the tyranny of debt altogether and to fight poverty, there has to be radically new thinking. The only solution for most poor countries is that their debt is written off completely. At the very least, their loan repayments are channeled back into genuine development that puts food growing, health and education before so-called economic growth. The banks are not solely to blame for the debt and poverty, but it's not possible for them to look after the interests of the rich world and the poor world at the same time. The World Bank and the IMF should be abolished and replaced by a real development agency that is non-profit making and entirely free of political strings and can help nations develop on their terms, meeting their needs. In Britain in the 1990s, the Third World and the ravages of debt have come home as the rich have got richer and the poor poorer. No other country in Europe has seen such a dramatic rise in poverty. 1 in 5 British children now lives in poverty. Of course, during the 1980s, a large number of people appeared to be doing well by living off debt. They had jobs and small businesses. But now jobs are being lost and businesses are going bankrupt, and 80,000 homes are being repossessed a year. Many of these people are now joining the homeless. And as in the Third World, poverty kills, says Professor Peter Townsend, a world authority. That is not a political or social comment, he said, but a scientific fact.
The debt crisis started in 1982, and if it goes on for another 10 years, think of all those 18-year-olds who will not have known anything in their entire lives but austerity. And those kids are extraordinarily frustrated and extraordinarily angry.
The human consequences of debt have been a largely unwritten story. And if you miss the chance when a child is 1 or 5 or 10 to provide the basic nutrition, the early education, a home with love and care, there will be consequences when that child is an adult. And I fear we will see those consequences and have to live with them 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Given that most countries do have enough resources to provide for their people, why should they have to tolerate a system that forces parents to watch their children die slowly, like the children of Eddie and Teresita in the Philippines? Indeed, why should the burden of debt fall to those least responsible for it? At the other end of the scale, why should British high street banks get tax relief of more than £1 billion just in case loans are not paid back? That amount of money would immunize 400 million children against preventable disease. Above all, why should the lives of ordinary people be controlled by a few who are themselves unaccountable and whose decisions and judgments are dictated by a belief that economics is meant not to serve people, but as some kind of holy writ requiring regular offerings, even blood sacrifices, to a God called the bottom line? The debt of all poor countries